Project Looking Glass, technology that shows all possible futures. There's a persistent claim within conspiracy theory circles and among certain alleged whistleblowers that the United States government, possibly operating through classified programs at facilities like Area 51 or S4, possesses technology called Project Looking Glass, a device that allegedly allows operators to view probable future timelines by manipulating quantum probability fields or by creating localized distortions in space-time that permit observation of events that haven't yet occurred from our temporal perspective. According to testimony from people claiming to have worked on or near the project, Looking Glass consists of a cylindrical apparatus, possibly involving rotating rings of exotic matter or electromagnetic field generators arranged to create specific space-time geometries, with a viewing screen or interface where operators can observe scenes from potential futures, witnessing outcomes of current decisions, seeing technological developments before they occur, observing catastrophes before they happen, essentially possessing a window into tomorrow that provides enormous strategic advantage to whoever controls it, the ability to make decisions with knowledge of their consequences, to avoid disasters by seeing them coming, to steal technological innovations by observing them in the future and developing them in the present, to win wars by knowing enemy actions before they're taken, to manipulate markets by foreseeing economic shifts, to control society by steering toward desired futures while avoiding timelines that contain undesirable outcomes. The existence of such technology would represent the ultimate information advantage, would explain certain prescient decisions or seemingly miraculous avoidance of catastrophes, would provide framework for understanding how elite groups might maintain power across generations by possessing knowledge of future events that allows them to position themselves optimally while everyone else operates blind, making decisions based on incomplete information about probable outcomes, while the Looking Glass operators possess clarity about which choices lead where. But the evidence for Project Looking Glass consists entirely of whistleblower testimony from individuals whose credentials are difficult to verify, whose access to classified programs can't be independently confirmed, and whose descriptions of the technology are vague enough to avoid specific falsifiable claims while dramatic enough to capture imagination, creating a situation where Looking Glass exists in permanent evidential limbo. Either the most significant classified technology in human possession, proving that future viewing is possible and that powerful groups have been using this capability to shape history according to their preferences, or an elaborate fiction, a story that combines real classified program names with fictional capabilities, that borrows from legitimate physics concepts about time and probability, while applying them in ways that actual physics doesn't support, that serves the conspiracy theory purpose of explaining why elites seem to always win, why certain groups maintain power despite apparent disadvantages, why history sometimes unfolds in ways that seem too convenient or too orchestrated to be mere chance, providing narrative framework where everything is planned, where accident and chaos are illusions, where those in control are operating with knowledge of future outcomes that makes their success inevitable rather than achieved through the messy contingent processes of actual history, leaving Project Looking Glass as either suppressed scientific breakthrough that proves time isn't linear and that future observation is achievable through sufficiently advanced technology, or as mythology, as story that believers in conspiracy need to be true to make sense of world, where power concentrates despite democratic institutions, where elite coordination seems too effective to be mere networking and shared interest, where the alternative, that Looking Glass doesn't exist and elites are just wealthy humans making educated guesses and sometimes getting lucky, feels less satisfying than believing in secret technology that explains everything. The primary source for Project Looking Glass claims is Dan Burish, also known as Dan Crane, who emerged in the early 2000s claiming to be a microbiologist who had worked on classified projects at Area 51 and S4, who had been exposed to various secret programs, including one involving time viewing technology. Burish provided detailed accounts of a looking glass in interviews, describing it as a cylindrical device several meters long, involving rotating components, creating what he described as an Einstein-Rosen bridge, or controlled wormhole that could be tuned to observe different probable future timelines. He claimed that multiple looking glass devices existed, that they were built using technology reverse-engineered from extraterrestrial craft, or that they were developed through black-budget physics programs that achieved breakthroughs far beyond publicly acknowledged science. According to Burish, Looking Glass showed operators that all observed futures converged toward a specific event or timeline convergence in the early 21st century, beyond which the futures diverged dramatically into either catastrophic or transcendent outcomes for humanity. This convergence point allegedly limited the device's usefulness because futures beyond it were unstable or couldn't be clearly observed, creating strategic problem for those using the technology. They could see consequences of current actions only up to this convergence point, beyond which all timelines became chaotic or uncertain, suggesting that humanity faced a crucial juncture where decisions made would determine which of the divergent post-convergence futures would manifest. The physics that would be required for Looking Glass to function as described doesn't exist in any verified form. Observing future events would require either faster-than-light information transfer, which relativity forbids, or would require that futures already exist in some sense, that time is block universe where past, present, and future coexist, and Looking Glass is simply a device for directing observation toward the future sections of the block. Even accepting block universe interpretation, the mechanism by which electromagnetic fields or rotating components could shift observation through time isn't described by any known physics. The Einstein-Rosen bridge, mentioned by Burish, is real concept from general relativity, a theoretical connection between distant points in space-time, commonly called a wormhole. But whether such structures can actually form, whether they could be stabilized, and whether they could be used for information transfer or observation, much less for viewing future events, remains entirely speculative and faces severe theoretical obstacles. The quantum probability interpretation that some Looking Glass accounts invoke suggests the device isn't viewing a predetermined future, but rather sampling from probability distributions, observing possible futures weighted by their likelihood, similar to many worlds interpretation, where all quantum possibilities branch into separate realities. In this framework, Looking Glass would show operators the most probable outcomes, given current conditions, allowing them to adjust variables to steer toward preferred probability branches. But this doesn't align with how quantum mechanics actually functions at macroscopic scales. Quantum indeterminacy averages out in large systems, making the future probabilistically predictable through normal analysis, rather than requiring exotic viewing technology. Classical chaos theory and complex systems modeling provide methods for forecasting probable futures without invoking quantum mechanics or time viewing technology. The strategic implications, if Looking Glass exists, would be profound. Any government or group possessing reliable future viewing technology would have insurmountable advantage over those without it. Military conflicts would be won before they started by side that could foresee enemy actions. Economic markets would be dominated by those who could see future prices and developments. Political battles would be controlled by those who could test messages and policies by observing their future effects. The technology would be so valuable that its very existence would be the most closely guarded secret, protected at any cost, because losing it or allowing adversaries to develop their own version would eliminate the advantage it provides. This raises the question of why, If Looking Glass exists, the United States or whoever possesses it hasn't achieved complete global domination. If you can see all possible futures and choose actions that lead to preferred outcomes, you should be effectively omniscient within the time range the technology permits viewing. The fact that geopolitical competition continues, that US strategic initiatives sometimes fail, that unexpected events occur that seemingly could have been foreseen and prevented, suggests either that Looking Glass doesn't exist, or that its capabilities are far more limited than the dramatic description suggests, or that other powers possess similar technology, creating a stalemate where everyone can see futures. But no one gains decisive advantage because all players are operating with similar information. The convergence point that Burish describes, a moment beyond which futures become chaotic and unpredictable, provides narrative explanation for why Looking Glass hasn't prevented all problems or created perfect control. If the technology only works up to a certain temporal horizon, and if we're currently near or past that horizon, then its utility would be limited. The convergence could represent limitations in the technology itself, or could represent actual properties of time and causality, where prediction becomes impossible beyond certain complexity thresholds, or where quantum indeterminacy accumulated over time makes futures genuinely undetermined beyond specific temporal distance. The connection to extraterrestrial technology that appears in some Looking Glass accounts places the device within broader UFO conspiracy narratives. If Looking Glass was reverse engineered from alien craft, it implies that advanced civilizations possess time-viewing capabilities, that such technology is achievable given sufficient scientific advancement, and that humans have gained access to it through recovered alien equipment rather than through our own research breakthroughs. This narrative serves to explain how humans could possess technology that seems to require physics far beyond our current understanding. We didn't develop it ourselves. We copied it from beings with thousands or millions of years of advancement beyond us. But this explanation requires accepting the premise that alien craft have been recovered, that reverse engineering alien technology is feasible despite the likely enormous gap in scientific principles and engineering approaches, and that the resulting device works despite humans not fully understanding the physics that underlies its operation. Each of these premises is controversial and unsupported by public evidence, making the alien origin story for Looking Glass depend on accepting multiple extraordinary claims that are themselves disputed. The alternative explanation is that Project Looking Glass exists as a real program name, but that the capabilities attributed to it are misunderstood or misrepresented. Classified research into various exotic physics concepts, wormholes, time dilation effects, quantum computing applications to forecasting, might operate under code names that include Looking Glass. Whistleblowers with partial access or understanding might conflate separate programs, might misinterpret what they saw or were told, might elaborate based on speculation rather than direct knowledge, creating accounts that mix real program names and real physics concepts with fictional capabilities that sound plausible to non-experts, but that don't match what the actual classified research achieved. The Project Preserve Destiny name appears in some accounts alongside or interchangeably with Looking Glass, sometimes described as overlapping programs or as different code names for the same technology at different periods. The proliferation of names and the variations in descriptions across different whistleblower accounts suggest either a complex history of multiple related programs with different capabilities and designations, or suggest that the accounts are elaborations and variations on a theme, rather than consistent testimony about a single, real technology. The societal control implications are central to why Looking Glass features in conspiracy theories. If government or elite groups possess future viewing technology, it transforms democracy and free will into theater. The outcomes are already known. Decisions are made by those with access to LookingGlass, who can see consequences. And the public participation in governance is meaningless because those in control are operating with information advantage so profound that manipulation is trivial. Every election, every policy debate, every social movement occurs within framework shaped by those who can see futures and steer society toward timelines they prefer. This narrative is psychologically appealing to conspiracy theorists because it provides totalizing explanation for complexity and inequality. The world isn't messy and chaotic with distributed power and genuine uncertainty about futures. Instead, it's controlled and predicted by hidden elite using suppressed technology. This explanation makes history comprehensible as planned sequence rather than as emergent property of millions of independent actors making decisions with limited information. It replaces chaos with control, accident with design, complexity with conspiracy. But evidence for LookingGlass remains elusive. Burish's testimony is detailed and internally consistent within his narrative, but his credentials have been questioned. His claimed positions at classified facilities can't be independently verified, and no physical evidence or documentation has been produced beyond his testimony and testimony from others in the same conspiracy theory communities. The accounts exist in an ecosystem where verification is impossible. The programs are too classified. The witnesses are threatened or suppressed. The evidence is destroyed or remains hidden in facilities that public researchers can't access. Every absence of evidence is explained as successful suppression, rather than as indication that the claims might be false. The question of whether we should want LookingGlass to exist is ethically complex. Future viewing technology could prevent catastrophes, could allow optimization of decisions for human benefit, could reduce suffering by allowing problems to be foreseen and addressed before they occur. But it could also enable unprecedented control, could eliminate genuine free will and uncertainty that many philosophers consider essential to meaning and ethics, could create two-tier society where those with access to future knowledge dominate those without. The technology would be so powerful that its misuse would be catastrophic, making it potentially more dangerous than beneficial, unless its control and use were perfectly ethical, which no human institution has ever achieved. Whether Project LookingGlass exists as described, exists in limited form far less dramatic than whistleblower accounts suggest, or doesn't exist at all and represents mythology that serves conspiracy theory purposes by providing explanation for elite power and coordination. The story demonstrates human fascination with time, with future knowledge, with the possibility of gaining information advantage that would transform powerlessness into control, uncertainty into confidence, chaos into predictability. The desire for LookingGlass to exist reflects desire to believe that someone knows what's coming, that history isn't random but planned, that the future isn't fundamentally uncertain but is knowable to those with right technology, even if we're not among those privileged few with access. The story persists because it can't be definitively disproven. Classified programs, by definition, don't have publicly accessible documentation. Suppressed technology, by definition, doesn't appear in scientific literature. And whistleblowers telling truth about highly classified breakthrough technology would face exactly the credibility problems and verification obstacles that LookingGlass witnesses face, making legitimate disclosure indistinguishable from fabrication unless physical evidence can be produced, which whistleblowers claim is impossible due to classification and security. This creates perfect, unfalsifiable conspiracy theory. All confirming evidence is suppressed. All disconfirming evidence is explained away. Belief or disbelief depends entirely on prior probability assessments about whether such technology is plausible and whether governments would develop and conceal it. Project LookingGlass remains what it has been since the claims first circulated. either the most significant classified technology in existence, proving that future viewing is achievable and that powerful groups have used this capability to shape history while keeping humanity ignorant of time's true nature and the malleability of destiny. Or a compelling fiction, a story that combines classified program nomenclature with speculative physics and conspiracy theory to create narrative that explains too much, that accounts for elite power through suppressed technology rather than through the mundane mechanisms of wealth, networks, information, asymmetry, and institutional advantage, leaving Lookingglass suspended between extraordinary truth and elaborate fiction, between classified breakthrough and mythological projection, between the device that shows all possible futures and the story that shows all possible conspiracy theories, existing in permanent uncertainty. Because verification requires access that isn't available. Because the extraordinary claims lack extraordinary evidence. Because whistleblower testimony without physical proof or corroboration creates belief rather than knowledge, faith rather than certainty, leaving those who encounter the Lookingglass story to decide for themselves whether time-viewing technology exists in classified facilities, whether operators right now are observing futures and making decisions based on knowledge of consequences, whether history is guided by those who can see tomorrow, or whether Lookingglass is myth, is legend, is the conspiracy theory that makes elite power comprehensible by attributing it to suppressed technology, rather than to the complex emergent properties of human societies, where power concentrates through mechanisms that don't require future-viewing devices, where decisions are made with uncertainty and imperfect information by everyone including the powerful, where the future remains genuinely unknown to all, where Project Lookingglass exists not as technology, but as story, as explanation, as the narrative that makes conspiracy theorists comfortable with worlds they can't otherwise understand, giving them framework where everything is planned and controlled rather than chaotic and contingent, where someone knows what's coming even if that someone isn't them, where the Lookingglass operators guide history toward predetermined outcomes while the rest of us live in ignorance, believing we're making choices that matter when the futures have already been observed and decisions have already been made by those with access to technology that shouldn't exist but that allegedly does. Technology that remains forever just beyond proof, forever just beyond verification, forever suspended in testimonial claims that can't be confirmed or denied without access to classified programs that may contain Project Lookingglass, or may contain nothing, may show all possible futures, or may show nothing at all except the human tendency to create myths about secret technology that explains why power concentrates and why elites win, why history unfolds as it does, and why ordinary people feel powerless, answered not by Lookingglass technology that doesn't exist, but by boring reality of wealth and institutions and information asymmetry that doesn't require exotic physics or time-viewing devices, leaving Project Lookingglass as permanent question, permanent possibility, permanent conspiracy theory that will continue circulating, continue being believed by some and dismissed by others, continue serving its function of explaining the inexplicable by invoking suppressed technology, continue existing in the space between classified truth and elaborate fiction, where verification is impossible and where belief depends not on evidence but on prior commitments about whether such technology could exist, whether governments would develop it, whether whistleblowers are telling truth or constructing mythology, whether the future is knowable or fundamentally uncertain, whether Project Lookingglass shows all possible futures or shows nothing because it exists or because it was always just story, always just legend, always just the conspiracy theory about technology that sees tomorrow. Gloomy Sunday, the song that made people end their lives. There's a melody that was composed in Hungary in 1933 that allegedly carries something in its structure, something in the arrangement of notes and the progression of chords that affects human consciousness in ways music isn't supposed to. It's called Gloomy Sunday, and according to legend and scattered documentation, the song has been directly linked to dozens, possibly hundreds, of deaths by suicide. People who heard it and felt compelled to end their lives within hours or days, as if the music planted something in their minds that grew until self-destruction became the only imaginable response. The composer himself eventually took his own life, decades after writing it. The song was banned from radio broadcast in multiple countries. Sheet music was pulled from stores, yet it persists, recorded by major artists, available now to anyone with internet access. The melody waiting in digital archives for the next person who'll hear it and feel something shift inside their consciousness. Some door opening onto darkness that wasn't there before they pressed play. The song was written by Rezo Seres, a Hungarian pianist and composer working in Budapest during the economic devastation of the Great Depression. Europe was drowning in poverty and despair. The future looked apocalyptic, and Seres channeled this collective misery into a composition he initially called Vége Vilányak. The world is ending. The melody is haunting and profoundly melancholic, moving through minor key progressions that create a sense of inexorable descent, of something falling that can never rise again. Lyrics were added later by poet Laszlo Javor, describing a person contemplating joining their deceased lover in death, standing at the edge of that decision while Sunday, traditionally a day of rest and worship, becomes the day they'll choose to end their suffering. The song became popular in Budapest cafes and clubs, but alongside its popularity came disturbing reports. The first alleged suicide connected to the song involved a shoemaker in Budapest who left a note saying he couldn't get the melody out of his head, that it had been playing in his thoughts continuously, driving him to a state where death seemed like the only escape from the music. Then a young woman drowned herself in the Danube after requesting the song at a nightclub. A shopkeeper hung himself with the sheet music for Gloomy Sunday in his pocket. The accounts accumulated, each linking the song to self-inflicted death, until Budapest newspapers began calling it the Hungarian suicide song and warning people against listening to it. The phenomenon spread as the song gained international attention. In America, where it was translated as Gloomy Sunday and recorded by Billie Holiday in 1941, reports emerged of people killing themselves after hearing the recording. A New York typist gassed herself with a copy of the sheet music clutched in her hand. A Berlin man requested the song at a nightclub and shot himself as it played. A London woman overdosed on pills while the record turned on her phonograph, found days later with the needle stuck in the final groove, the melody's ending repeating over and over in the empty room. The BBC banned it. Multiple radio networks across Europe and America refused to play it. Record stores stopped stocking it. Yet the song's reputation only enhanced its dark allure, making people seek it out specifically to hear what was so dangerous, what could possibly be encoded in a simple melody that would make someone choose death. The mechanisms proposed for how the song might work vary from the psychological to the occult. The most rational explanation suggests it's purely contextual. People who are already suicidally depressed are drawn to melancholic music. And Gloomy Sunday, with its reputation and deeply sad melody, becomes a catalyst that pushes them from contemplation to action. The song doesn't cause the suicidal ideation, but crystallizes it, gives it a soundtrack, makes the idea of death seem beautiful or poetic rather than tragic. In this framework, the song is dangerous only to those already vulnerable, and the deaths attributed to it would have occurred anyway, perhaps to different music or triggers. But this doesn't explain the consistency of reports, the specific claims that the melody itself was inescapable, that it played in people's minds without stopping, that it seemed to override other thoughts and create obsessive loops where death became the only coherent concept. Multiple suicide notes from different people in different countries described the same experience. The song wouldn't leave them alone. It played constantly in their heads. They couldn't sleep because the melody continued. They couldn't concentrate on anything else because the music filled their consciousness. This suggests something beyond simple emotional resonance with sad material. It suggests the melody itself has properties that affect cognitive function, that the specific arrangement of intervals and progressions creates states of consciousness that become self-sustaining and harmful. Musical theorists have analyzed the composition looking for what might make it different from other sad songs, why Gloomy Sunday specifically would have effects that thousands of other melancholic melodies don't produce. The chord progressions are unusual, moving in ways that violate listener expectations, creating unresolved tension that the brain struggles to process. The melody doesn't provide the resolution and release that most music offers, doesn't give the listener a sense of completion or emotional arc. It spirals downward without climbing back up, without offering hope or transformation. Listening to it is like watching something fall without ever hitting the ground, descent that continues past the point where it should end, leaving the brain in a state of perpetual anticipation that never gets satisfied. There's also speculation about resonance frequencies, the idea that certain sound patterns can affect brain chemistry or neural oscillations in ways that destabilize mood regulation. If the song happens to hit frequencies or rhythmic patterns that interfere with the brain's normal production or uptake of serotonin or other neurotransmitters involved in mood stability, extended exposure could theoretically push someone from sad to suicidal by literally altering their neurochemistry through sonic input. This remains speculative. No rigorous scientific study has established that Gloomy Sunday affects brain function differently than other music. But the consistency of reports across decades and cultures suggests something about this specific composition, not just its emotional content, but its structural elements, might interact with human consciousness in unusual ways. The more exotic theories suggest intentional encoding, that Seresse consciously or unconsciously embedded something in the composition, some pattern or frequency that carries information or influence beyond the surface melody. In occult frameworks, music is understood as vibrational magic, as patterns that shape consciousness and reality through resonance. A composer working in a state of profound despair, channeling the collective anguish of a civilization in collapse, might tap into frequencies that manifest that despair in others, that transmit it like a virus through the medium of melody. The song becomes a carrier wave for the emotional state that created it, infecting listeners with depression so profound that death seems not just acceptable, but necessary. Rezo Seresse himself lived with the song's dark reputation for decades. He couldn't escape it. Every interview, every mention of his work, focused on Gloomy Sunday and its alleged body count. The song that should have brought him fame and wealth instead brought notoriety and a kind of cursed celebrity. In 1968, at age 69, Seresse jumped from his Budapest apartment window. The song had finally claimed its creator, or perhaps the weight of being associated with so much death, of having composed something that allegedly pushed people toward suicide, became unbearable. His death completed a circle that had begun 35 years earlier, when he first wrote the melody, as if the song had always been leading to this conclusion, had encoded his own death in its structure from the beginning. The question of whether music can actually kill, whether a melody can be so perfectly crafted to trigger self-destruction that hearing it creates genuine danger, challenges our understanding of how consciousness works and how much external input can affect internal states. We know music affects mood. It's used therapeutically to manage depression and anxiety, used commercially to manipulate purchasing behavior, used in warfare to disorient or break enemy combatants. But the idea that a single song could consistently push vulnerable people over the edge from depression into suicide implies a level of power that most people are uncomfortable attributing to art. Yet the deaths connected to Gloomy Sunday are documented in newspapers and police reports from the 1930s and 40s. Some can be verified, others remain anecdotal, and the actual number is impossible to confirm because causes of suicide are complex, and many people who died may have heard the song without anyone knowing. It played a role in their decision. But dismissing all of it as urban legend ignores substantial historical documentation that something unusual was happening, that enough suicides were linked to this specific song that multiple governments took action to restrict its broadcast and distribution. Modern listeners can find the song easily online, can hear various recordings, and judge for themselves whether it produces unusual effects. Most report finding it sad and haunting, but not dangerous, not producing anything beyond ordinary emotional response to melancholic music. But occasionally, someone will comment that they had to stop listening, that it affected them more deeply than music should, that it created a heaviness or despair that lingered for hours or days, that the melody did stick in their mind in ways that felt invasive rather than just catchy. These contemporary reports echo the historical accounts. Most people are unaffected beyond normal sadness, but a subset experiences something more intense, something that suggests individual vulnerability to whatever the song carries. The song exists in multiple versions, each with slightly different arrangements and lyrics. The Billie Holiday recording is probably the most famous, her voice adding layers of lived pain to the already mournful melody. Some versions are purely instrumental, removing the explicit suicide ideation from the lyrics while maintaining the musical structure that allegedly caused the original effects. If the danger is in the melody itself, rather than the lyrical content, then instrumental versions should be equally problematic. If it's the combination of music and words that creates the effect, then instrumental versions should be safer. Reports don't clearly support either conclusion. Both lyrical and instrumental versions have been associated with listener distress. There are also claims that certain recordings are more dangerous than others, that early pressings or specific performances captured something that later, cleaned-up versions smoothed out. Audiophiles and collectors speak about original pressings having a rawness or quality that reissues lack, and in the case of Gloomy Sunday, this might not just be about sound fidelity, but about how completely the despair and darkness of the original composition and performance was preserved. Modern digital remasters might technically sound better while removing some essential quality that made the song dangerous, sanitizing it in the process of making it clearer. The persistence of the song, despite its reputation, suggests that banning it doesn't work, that prohibition only increases its appeal. People seek out dangerous things, want to experience what others have warned against, believe they'll be the exception who can handle it. Gloomy Sunday exists now as freely available digital audio, and anyone reading about its history can find and play it within seconds. If it truly is dangerous, then making it easily accessible seems reckless. If it's not, then its reputation is built on coincidence and myth, and there's no harm in listening. But the uncertainty itself is troubling. We don't actually know for certain whether the song has properties that make it hazardous to vulnerable individuals, and our culture has decided that availability is more important than potential risk. What we're left with is a melody composed during humanity's darkest hours between the wars, a song that captured something essential about despair and hopelessness, that became associated with dozens of deaths by suicide, that was banned and feared and sought after, that killed its own composer decades after he wrote it, and that exists now as a historical curiosity that most people can listen to safely, while a small percentage might experience something that proves the legends weren't entirely fabricated. Whether Gloomy Sunday actually has power to push vulnerable minds towards self-destruction, or whether it simply became a focal point for suicide contagion during an era of widespread despair. The accumulated weight of its history suggests that some melodies carry more than just notes and rhythm, that music can be a vector for states of consciousness that transcend simple emotion, and that a song written to express the feeling that the world is ending might have succeeded so perfectly in capturing that feeling that it transmits it like a virus to anyone who opens their mind to receive it, leaving them infected with despair that has no antidote except silence, except stopping the music, except ensuring that the melody finally, permanently ends. Children's drawings of previous lives they never lived. There are cases documented across cultures and continents where young children, typically between ages 2 and 6, begin spontaneously describing lives they claim to have lived before, providing names, locations, and specific details about people and events they shouldn't have any knowledge of. Memories that emerge without prompting from parents who often find the claims disturbing rather than encouraging. But some of these children don't just talk about their alleged previous lives. They draw them, creating pictures that depict places they've never been, people they've never met, events they never witnessed in their current existence, producing artwork with details that can sometimes be verified through historical research, or by locating the people and places the child describes. Details that seem impossible for a young child to know through normal means. A 4-year-old draws a specific house in a distant town they've never visited, including architectural features and landscape elements that match the actual location when investigators check. A 5-year-old sketches a person they claim was their spouse in a previous life, and the drawing resembles photographs of a real person who died years before the child was born, someone the child's family has no connection to and had never heard of. A 3-year-old depicts a traumatic death, a plane crash, a drowning, a violent incident, with details that correspond to actual historical events, accidents that occurred decades earlier in locations the child has no exposure to, rendering scenes they should have no way of visualizing with an accuracy that disturbs parents and fascinates researchers who investigate claims of reincarnation. These aren't vague, impressionistic sketches that could represent anything, but specific detailed drawings that contain verifiable information, that depict real places and real people and real events from the past, created by children too young to have learned this information through conventional means, too young in many cases to have been taught much about history or geography, producing artwork that suggests they're accessing memories of experiences they never had in their current lives. Memories that, if genuine, would prove that consciousness survives death and can transfer between bodies. That reincarnation isn't religious mythology, but documentable reality. Or alternatively, that children are somehow accessing information through means we don't understand, collective unconscious, telepathy, genetic memory, or some other mechanism that allows knowledge to transfer across time and space in ways that conventional neuroscience doesn't acknowledge, leaving researchers and families confronting drawings that shouldn't exist, that contain information children shouldn't possess, that either prove reincarnation or prove that human consciousness and memory work in ways far stranger than materialism allows, ways that permit young children to know things about the past that they have no normal means of knowing, to visualize scenes they never witnessed, to draw people they never met, to depict lives they never lived, but that they claim with absolute certainty were theirs before they were born. into their current bodies before their current memories began when they were someone else living somewhere else, in circumstances that ended and that somehow left traces in consciousness that survived death and reanimated in new bodies, in children who remember and who draw what they remember, creating visual documentation of the impossible, of memories that transcend individual lifespans, of consciousness that persists beyond death, or of something equally strange that allows children to access historical information through mechanisms neuroscience hasn't discovered, leaving their drawings as evidence that demands explanation, but that resists easy categorization as either proof of reincarnation or proof of elaborate coincidence and false memory. The research into children's past life claims has been most extensively documented by psychiatrist Ian Stevenson and his successor, Jim Tucker, at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. Over decades, they've investigated thousands of cases where children report memories of previous lives, focusing on cases where the children provide specific verifiable details that can be checked against historical records or by locating the families of the deceased persons the children claim to have been. The strongest cases involve children who name their previous identity, describe their death, identify family members from their claimed previous life by name or relationship, and provide details about locations, possessions, or events that are later confirmed as accurate when investigators locate the previous family and verify the information against their knowledge and records. The drawings add a dimension beyond verbal testimony. A child might describe a previous life in ways that parents could unconsciously influence through leading questions, or that could be confabulated from fragments of overheard information. But drawings capture visual detail that's harder to explain through suggestion. When a child draws a specific building's architecture, including details like window placement, door configuration, unique structural features, and surrounding landscape elements, and that drawing matches a real location the child has never visited or seen photographs of, the explanation through normal means becomes strained. When a child draws a person's face with distinctive features, and that drawing resembles photographs of the deceased person they claim to have been, the coincidence starts to seem less plausible. One documented case from Thailand involved a child who drew detailed pictures of a previous life as a teacher in a specific school in a town he'd never been to. The drawings included the school building's layout, the arrangement of desks in the classroom, and even specific decorative elements in the room. When researchers took the child to the town he'd described, the school existed with architecture and interior details matching his drawings, despite the child never having visited or seen pictures of the location. The family of the deceased teacher confirmed that the child's descriptions and drawings accurately depicted the teacher's life, workplace, and death, providing details that the child's family had no way of knowing and that weren't in public records or accessible through normal research methods. Another case from India involved a girl who from age 3 described being a woman who had died in a neighboring village, providing the woman's name, family details, and descriptions of her house and possessions. The child drew pictures of the house, including specific decorative items, the arrangement of rooms, and a distinctive tree in the courtyard. When the two families eventually connected, the drawings matched the deceased woman's actual home, including details like the position of certain religious pictures on walls and the specific type of tree the girl had drawn. The deceased woman's family confirmed that these details were accurate but weren't widely known outside the immediate household, making it difficult to explain how the child could have learned them through normal information channels. The American cases documented by Tucker often involve children who draw scenes from past lives with details that are later verified. A boy in Oklahoma began at age 4, talking about being a Hollywood extra in the 1930s and 40s, providing specific details about movies and actors and life in Hollywood during that era. His drawings included specific buildings, cars, and street scenes from that period, rendered with accuracy that seemed impossible for a child in the 1990s to possess without exposure to detailed historical resources about Hollywood's golden age. When researchers investigated, they were able to identify the person the child claimed to have been, a Hollywood extra who had died in the 1970s, and verified many of the child's claims and drawings against historical records and surviving photographs from that era. The spontaneity of these memories and drawings is significant. The children aren't prompted or encouraged to remember previous lives. The memories emerge spontaneously, often to parents' confusion or distress, particularly in Western cultures where reincarnation isn't part of the dominant belief system. Parents often initially dismiss the claims, try to discourage the child from talking about it, or become worried that their child is disturbed or fantasizing. The fact that memories persist despite parental discouragement suggests they're not being reinforced or encouraged by the family environment. The memories typically fade as children get older. By age 7 or 8, most children who reported previous life memories stop talking about them, and when interviewed later, often have little to no recollection of having made the claims. This developmental pattern is consistent across cultures and cases, suggesting a window in early childhood where whatever mechanism allows access to these memories is active, closing as the child's current life personality and memories become more dominant, and as the neural structures supporting current identity solidify. The trauma correlation is notable. Many children who report previous life memories describe deaths that were violent or traumatic. Accidents, murders, warfare, sudden illness. The percentage of cases involving traumatic death is far higher than the percentage of deaths that are traumatic in the general population, suggesting that violent or sudden death might somehow make memories more likely to persist or transfer. This could indicate that unresolved trauma at death creates stronger memory traces, or could indicate that the mechanism by which memories transfer is somehow activated or facilitated by trauma. Birthmarks and birth defects that correspond to fatal wounds from claimed previous lives appear in some cases. Children with birthmarks matching the location of fatal gunshot wounds described in their previous life memories, scars that correspond to surgical incisions from the previous person's medical history, or physical anomalies that match injuries or conditions the previous person had. Stevenson documented hundreds of these cases, photographing the birthmarks and comparing them to medical records or autopsy reports from the deceased persons, finding matches that seem too specific to be coincidental. The cultural variation is significant. Cases are reported most frequently in cultures where reincarnation is an accepted belief: Buddhism, Hinduism, various indigenous traditions. But they occur in Western contexts as well, just less frequently or less openly due to cultural resistance to the concept. Whether this reflects actual difference in reincarnation rates or merely difference in reporting and acknowledgement is unclear. Parents in cultures that believe in reincarnation might notice and document behaviors that Western parents dismiss or discourage. The skeptical explanations focus on false memory, suggestion, coincidence, and fraud. Children are highly suggestible and imaginative, capable of confabulating elaborate false memories from fragmentary inputs. Parents who believe in reincarnation might unconsciously cue children, might ask leading questions, might selectively remember and report the hits while forgetting the misses. The verification process might be contaminated by confirmation bias, with investigators finding patterns and matches that seem significant because they're looking for them, and some cases might involve deliberate fraud, families fabricating claims for attention or religious validation. But the best documented cases resist easy dismissal. when children provide specific names, addresses, and details that can be independently verified before the families have contact, when they draw locations they've never seen with accuracy that seems beyond coincidence. When birthmarks match fatal wounds documented in medical records, the conventional explanations strain. Either these cases represent evidence of some mechanism by which consciousness or information transfers across lives, or they represent remarkable strings of coincidence and contamination that somehow produce specificity that seems impossible through chance. The mechanism, if reincarnation is real, remains unknown. How does consciousness survive death? How does it select or find a new body? What determines when and where reincarnation occurs? Why do only some people report previous life memories? What exactly transfers? Is it soul, consciousness, information, quantum states? The Buddhist and Hindu frameworks that have explored reincarnation for millennia provide religious and philosophical answers, but not mechanisms that scientific materialism can accept or test. Alternative explanations that don't require reincarnation include genetic memory, information somehow encoded in DNA from ancestors, though this can't explain cases where children remember lives as people unrelated to their family. Collective unconscious a la Jung, accessing archetypal information or memories stored in some universal field, though this doesn't explain the specific individual details children provide. Telepathy, or super ESP, somehow psychically accessing information about deceased persons from still living people who knew them, or from records, though this requires accepting psychic abilities that are themselves unproven. Cryptomnesia, memories of information encountered and forgotten, though this struggles to explain cases where children provide information that doesn't exist in accessible form for them to have encountered. The implications if genuine reincarnation is occurring are profound for understanding consciousness, death, identity, and the nature of self. If consciousness survives death and reanimates in new bodies, then materialism is false. Consciousness isn't merely emergent property of brain function. Death isn't the end of experience, and personal identity is more fluid and complex than we typically conceive. The person you are might be a continuation of someone who died before you were born, carrying forward memories and possibly personality traits and phobias and inclinations from previous existence. The drawings provide a specific form of evidence that's both compelling and puzzling. They're spontaneous productions by young children, visual representations of claimed memories, containing details that can be verified or falsified. They're harder to dismiss than verbal testimony because they capture information that seems impossible for children to fabricate without access to visual references they shouldn't have. A child who's never seen photographs of 1940s. Hollywood shouldn't be able to draw accurate period details. A child who's never visited a distant town shouldn't be able to sketch specific buildings with accurate architectural features. Yet the drawings also aren't perfect. They're child drawings, rendered with the motor skills and artistic ability of young children, which means they're imprecise, stylized, sometimes ambiguous. This imprecision creates interpretive latitude. How much does a child's drawing have to match a real location to count as a hit? How much similarity is required before we call it evidence rather than coincidence? The subjective element in evaluating whether drawings match their claimed reference creates opportunity for bias to influence conclusions. The pattern across thousands of cases investigated over decades suggests something genuine is occurring, even if its nature remains disputed. Children across cultures spontaneously provide detailed information about deceased persons' lives, information that can be verified and that the children shouldn't have normal access to. The addition of drawings that visually depict these claimed memories adds a layer of documentation that strengthens the most compelling cases while also revealing the limitations and ambiguities that prevent definitive proof. Whether these children are genuinely remembering previous lives, whether they're accessing information through unknown psychic or consciousness mechanisms, whether the cases represent elaborate coincidence and false memory, or whether some combination of factors creates the appearance of past life memory. When something else is actually occurring, their drawings remain as artifacts that demand explanation. Visual representations of claimed memories that children too young to have agendas create spontaneously. Drawings that sometimes contain verifiable details that seem impossible for the children to know, that depict places and people and events from before they were born, that if genuine would prove consciousness survives death, and that human identity isn't bound to a single lifetime, but continues across multiple existences, reincarnating with memories that sometimes persist in early childhood before fading as the new life's experiences overwrite the old, leaving only these drawings as documentation, only the artwork created by children who remember living before, who remember dying and being born again, who draw what they remember from lives they claim were theirs, lives that ended and that somehow left traces in consciousness that transferred into new bodies, into children who for a few years remember and who draw and who tell anyone who'll listen that they lived before, that they were someone else, that they died and came back. And here are the drawings to prove it. Pictures that either document the impossible or document the most elaborate false memories children have ever spontaneously generated. Drawings that researchers study and skeptics dismiss and parents keep in uncertain wonder, never quite sure whether their child is accessing genuine memories from a previous life or whether something else is creating the impression of memory when no actual previous life existed, leaving the drawings in permanent ambiguity, evidence that could prove reincarnation or could prove nothing, depending on how you interpret them, depending on what you believe about consciousness and death, and whether identity can persist across the boundary that separates one life from the next, whether children can remember lives they never lived in their current bodies, whether their drawings depict real previous experiences or impossible false memories, whether consciousness survives death, or whether these cases represent something equally strange that we don't yet understand, leaving the drawings as they are, created by children, depicting claimed previous lives, containing sometimes verifiable details, challenging materialism, supporting reincarnation beliefs, resisting definitive proof, remaining forever in that uncertain space where the most interesting evidence lives, where proof and disproof both seem possible, but neither seems achievable, where children's artwork becomes testimony about the nature of consciousness and death, and whether we live once or many times, whether death ends us or merely transitions us to new beginning, whether these children truly remember previous lives, or whether they're accessing something we can't explain, drawing pictures we can't dismiss, creating evidence we can't ignore but can't definitively interpret, leaving us with drawings of previous lives they never lived, or that they did live before being born again, before becoming who they are now, before forgetting as they always do by age 7 or 8, leaving only the drawings from when they still remembered, when they could still access whatever memories or information or consciousness fragments persist across death and rebirth, captured in child-rendered pictures that are either the most compelling evidence for reincarnation or the most puzzling false memories children spontaneously generate, drawings that remain, that document something, that prove either everything or nothing, depending on what framework you use to interpret them, leaving children's drawings of previous lives they never lived, or that they did live as permanent testimony to mysteries we can't solve, questions we can't answer, evidence we possess but can't conclusively evaluate, drawings that exist as artifacts of childhood, of claimed past lives, of consciousness that might survive death, of memories that might transfer across lifetimes, of children who remember and draw what they remember before forgetting, before becoming fully themselves in this life, before the previous life fades completely, leaving only drawings, only memories in picture form, only evidence that tantalizes and frustrates, that suggests reincarnation might be real, that consciousness might survive death, that children might genuinely remember previous existences, or that something equally mysterious creates these effects through mechanisms we haven't discovered, leaving the drawings as they are and have always been unexplained, fascinating, disturbing, compelling, ambiguous. Evidence of something, but evidence that refuses to definitively tell us what that something is. Liminal spaces. Why certain empty places feel wrong. There are places that feel wrong even though nothing overtly threatening is present. Empty hotel hallways lit by fluorescent lights that hum with electrical persistence. Abandoned shopping malls where the architecture of commerce persists without the people who were supposed to fill it. Parking garages in the dead hours, between night and morning, when your footsteps echo against concrete that stretches endlessly in every direction. Office buildings seen from outside at 3 a.m., where a few scattered lights reveal spaces that should be occupied but aren't. Stairwells that exist between floors serving purely transitional purposes. Airport terminals, in that suspended time between flights when most shops are closed and the few travelers present seem like ghosts moving through a space designed for thousands. These are liminal spaces, places defined by transition and in-betweenness, locations that exist to be passed through rather than inhabited. And when you encounter them empty or outside their intended context, when you're present in them during hours or conditions when you're not supposed to be, something in human consciousness recognizes wrongness that can't be rationally explained, produces unease that seems disproportionate to actual threat, creates the sense that you've stepped outside normal reality into a version that's slightly off, that functions according to different rules, that might contain things or allow events that the populated daylight version of these spaces would prevent, leaving you feeling watched or exposed or displaced in ways that make you want to leave quickly, that make you understand viscerally that humans aren't meant to occupy these transitional spaces, that being present in them when they're empty transforms them into something other than what they're supposed to be, reveals them as stages without actors, as infrastructure without purpose, as the bones of civilization showing through skin that's supposed to hide them. And this revelation, this seeing places in states they're not meant to be seen, produces psychological responses that range from vague discomfort to profound existential dread, depending on individual sensitivity and the specific characteristics of the space being experienced. The aesthetic of liminal spaces has become recognized and cataloged through internet communities that share images of these transitional zones, creating collective awareness of something that was previously just individual experience, diffuse unease that people felt but didn't have language or framework for discussing. The images that resonate most strongly share characteristics. They're empty of people, but show signs of recent or intended human presence. They're well lit, but with artificial light that creates harsh shadows and eliminates the variations of natural illumination. They're clean and maintained, but somehow feel abandoned or wrong. They show familiar architectural elements, but in configurations or contexts that feel strange. They capture spaces during times or in conditions when you don't normally experience them, creating disjunction between what the space is supposed to be and what it is in the captured moment. The psychological explanation centers on evolutionary responses to environmental cues. Humans evolved to find emptiness threatening. In ancestral environments, being alone or encountering empty spaces that should contain people might indicate danger, might mean predators have scared away the group, might suggest contamination or threat that others have fled from. Modern liminal spaces trigger these ancient responses because they present environmental incongruity. Spaces clearly designed for many people but containing none. Locations that exist specifically for human activity, but that are experienced in states where that activity has ceased or hasn't begun, creating a mismatch between expectation and reality that our threat detection systems interpret as potentially dangerous, even though rational assessment identifies no specific threat. The lighting in liminal spaces contributes significantly to their unsettling quality. Fluorescent lights produce constant, shadowless illumination that eliminates the variations and movements that natural light creates. This unchanging quality makes time feel suspended, makes it difficult to gauge how long you've been in the space, creates an eternal present moment that's disorienting because human consciousness normally tracks time partly through light changes. The specific frequency and quality of fluorescent light may also affect consciousness directly. Studies have shown that certain lighting frequencies can influence mood, cognitive function, and even produce subtle perceptual anomalies. Though whether this explains the liminal space effect or merely contributes to it remains unclear. The architecture of liminality has common elements: long hallways that create forced perspective, making distances hard to judge; repetitive patterns that make navigation and spatial memory difficult; layouts that prioritize movement flow rather than destination comfort; materials like tile and concrete that create acoustic properties where sound behaves strangely; extensive use of right angles and standardized dimensions that make everything feel manufactured and artificial. These design choices make sense for their intended functions. Airports and hotels need to move people efficiently. Parking structures need to maximize space. But when experienced without the crowds and activity that justify them, the design becomes oppressive, becomes visible as infrastructure rather than environment, becomes the skeleton of purpose without the flesh of actual human use. The temporal dimension is crucial. Liminal spaces feel most wrong when experienced at the wrong time, encountering them at 3 a.m., or during hours when they should be populated but aren't, when you're the only person present in a space designed for hundreds or thousands, when the normal schedule that regulates these spaces has been suspended and you're experiencing them outside their intended temporal context. This temporal wrongness compounds the spatial wrongness, creating a sense that you've slipped between the cracks of normal time, that you're experiencing reality in a mode that isn't supposed to be accessible, that the rules might be different here in this empty at the wrong time version of a space that exists differently when properly populated. The connection to dreams and unconscious imagery is frequently noted. Liminal spaces resemble environments that appear in dreams. Endless hallways, empty familiar locations, transitional spaces where you're trying to get somewhere but never quite arrive. Whether liminal spaces feel wrong because they resemble dream architecture, or whether dreams include liminal spaces because they represent psychologically significant transitional states is unclear. But the overlap suggests these spaces touch something deep in human consciousness, represent psychological states as much as physical locations, embody the anxiety of being between, of not quite being anywhere, of existing in transition. The backrooms phenomenon emerged directly from liminal space aesthetics, a collaborative fiction describing infinite levels of empty yellow rooms with water-stained carpet and buzzing fluorescent lights that exist behind or underneath normal reality, that you can accidentally glitch into by no-clipping through reality's boundaries, where you wander forever through procedurally generated emptiness, occasionally encountering entities or other lost people. The backrooms represent liminal space anxiety, taken to its extreme, the transitional space becoming permanent, the place you're not supposed to stay becoming the only place you can be. The wrongness of liminality becoming your entire reality. The fact that this concept resonated so powerfully across internet culture suggests that many people recognize the specific dread that liminal spaces produce, relate to the idea that the wrong kind of empty space can feel like you've left normal reality entirely. The nostalgia element in liminal spaces is paradoxical. Images of empty malls, abandoned playgrounds, old computer labs, unused pool areas, vintage hotel interiors produce simultaneous unease and longing, suggesting that liminal spaces trigger memories of childhood or past experiences, but filtered through temporal distance that makes them feel wrong. You remember being in these kinds of places when they were functioning and occupied, and seeing them empty creates cognitive dissonance between memory and present perception, between the vital busy place you remember and the hollow empty version you're seeing, suggesting that all spaces eventually become liminal, that everything ends up abandoned and empty, that the places we remember are already gone, even if structures that resemble them still physically exist. The commercial spaces are particularly powerful as liminal locations because they exist to serve capitalist functions of exchange and consumption. And when those functions cease, when the stores are empty and the registers are unmanned and the products are absent, what remains is naked infrastructure, the mechanisms of commerce visible without the activity that justifies them. Dead malls, empty retail spaces, shuttered shopping centers become monuments to failed enterprise, to the temporariness of economic structures, to the fact that places built to seem permanent and vital can become obsolete and abandoned within decades or even years, their architectural bones remaining long after their purpose has disappeared. Educational spaces carry similar weight. Empty schools, abandoned classrooms, unused gymnasiums feel wrong because these spaces are defined entirely by the students who should occupy them, by the learning and activity that should fill them. Without those human purposes, the spaces become hollow shells, and encountering them empty feels like witnessing something that's died, like standing in a body that no longer contains life. The institutional quality of educational architecture, the standardization and functionality, becomes oppressive when the institution isn't functioning. When you're present in the infrastructure without the human activity that animates it. Transportation infrastructure might be the purest form of liminal space, places that literally exist only to facilitate movement between destinations that have no purpose beyond transition. Airport terminals, train stations, subway platforms, highway rest stops, parking structures are designed never to be destinations, always to be passed through, and being present in them feels fundamentally temporary and unstable, even under normal populated conditions. When empty or experienced during off hours, these spaces intensify their inherent liminality, become extremely pure versions of in-betweenness, places where you're neither where you were nor where you're going, suspended in transit, existing in a state that's by definition temporary and transitional. The geographical component affects liminal space perception. The American landscape, with its sprawling suburbs, strip malls, highway systems, and standardized commercial architecture, repeated identically across thousands of locations, produces liminal aesthetics more readily than older, more varied architectural environments. The newness and standardization mean you could be anywhere or nowhere. Landmark and place-specific identity are reduced. Everything looks like everything else, and this generic quality makes the spaces feel unreal, makes them feel like sets or simulations, rather than actual places with history and specificity. When emptied of people, these genericized landscapes become supremely liminal, become the architecture of nowhere, of standardization and repetition, creating spaces that exist more as concepts than as actual lived places. The horror dimension of liminal spaces draws on their inherent wrongness. Horror fiction and games increasingly use liminal aesthetics because these spaces naturally produce unease, provide settings where the normal rules feel suspended, where threat feels possible, even though nothing overtly threatening is present. The empty space itself becomes the threat, or rather the potential of the empty space. The fact that it could contain anything, because you can't see what's around the next identical corner, can't predict what might emerge from the transitional emptiness that surrounds you. The experience of being in liminal spaces varies individually. Some people are highly sensitive to the disorienting, disturbing qualities of these environments, feel intense wrongness and desire to leave, experience actual anxiety or distress when trapped in liminal conditions. Others notice the strangeness but aren't particularly disturbed, can navigate and occupy transitional spaces without significant psychological impact. This variation might relate to different threat sensitivity, to how strongly individual nervous systems respond to environmental incongruity, to whether personal history or trauma makes empty or transitional spaces particularly triggering. The pandemic intensified global experience of liminality. Familiar spaces became empty or reconfigured. Streets and stores and public places that should have been populated stood vacant. The normal rhythms of activity were suspended, and people worldwide experienced their environments in liminal states, seeing them at the wrong times in the wrong conditions, witnessing emptiness where crowds should have been. This collective experience of seeing our environments in states they weren't supposed to be in, of experiencing the infrastructure of normal life without the activity that animates it, created widespread recognition of what liminal spaces feel like, of that wrongness that comes from being present in places that are functioning incorrectly, that are showing their bones, that are empty when they shouldn't be. Whether liminal spaces are purely psychological phenomenon, whether they're locations where something genuinely strange occurs because of their transitional nature, whether they're places where reality is thinner or where consciousness behaves differently, or whether they simply represent human sensitivity to environmental wrongness and evolutionary responses to emptiness. The experience remains consistent across millions of people who recognize immediately what liminal aesthetics capture, who feel the wrongness in images of empty hallways and abandoned malls, who understand without explanation why certain empty places feel not just lonely, but actively wrong, feel not just vacant, but threatening, feel not just transitional, but like you've stepped outside normal time and space into a version of reality that shouldn't be accessible, that you've somehow glitched into, like the backrooms concept describes, finding yourself in spaces that exist, but that you're not supposed to occupy, that have purposes, but that those purposes don't include you being there right now in these conditions, making you a trespasser, not in the legal sense, but in a deeper sense. A person present in spaces and times that the architecture and purpose of these places never intended for occupation, making you wrong for being there as much as the place is wrong for being empty, creating mutual wrongness that produces the discomfort and unease and vague dread that characterizes liminal space experience, that makes you want to move quickly through and out of these transitional zones, that makes you understand why these are places to pass through, not to remain in. Why staying in liminal spaces for extended periods feels like tempting something, like remaining in a state that's inherently unstable, like existing in a crack in reality that might close while you're still in it, trapping you in liminality, in the state of betweenness, in the architectural emptiness that was never meant for extended human occupation, in the fluorescent lit hallways that go nowhere and everywhere, in the parking garages that contain only echoes, in the abandoned mall where everything is maintained but nothing is alive, in the hotel corridor at 3 a.m. where you're the only guest and the carpet pattern repeats infinitely in both directions, in the liminal spaces that exist throughout our built environment, waiting empty and humming and wrong for those moments when someone encounters them outside their proper context and feels for an instant that reality has thinned, that the boundaries have weakened, that they've stepped somewhere they weren't supposed to be, somewhere between where they were and where they're going, somewhere that exists only to be passed through, but where they've somehow stopped, frozen in transition, suspended in the wrongness of liminal space, where time feels stuck and direction feels uncertain, and the normal rules of being somewhere don't quite apply, because you're not really somewhere. You're between. You're in the hallway between rooms, in the stairwell between floors, in the terminal between departures, in the space that has no identity except as passage, in the architecture of pure transition that when encountered empty reveals itself as the stage said it always was, as the infrastructure without the activity, as the bones of purpose without the flesh of human use, as liminal, as wrong, as the places that feel wrong precisely because they're places that shouldn't feel like anything, that should be invisible in their transitional function, that become visible only when something goes wrong, when you're there at the wrong time, or the space is empty when it should be full, or you're alone when you should be accompanied by the crowds that justify these vast commercial and institutional spaces, leaving you standing in wrongness, in liminality, in the uncomfortable recognition that the places we build and move through every day can transform into something deeply unsettling, something that triggers ancient fears and modern anxieties, something that makes us understand viscerally that certain empty places feel wrong because they are wrong, are places that exist outside proper occupation, are spaces we were never meant to really see or know. We're only meant to pass through without thinking, without looking too closely, without noticing how strange they are, how empty they can be, how deeply wrong they feel when you're present in them in the wrong way at the wrong time, experiencing liminality, not as quick transition, but as prolonged state, not as passing through, but as being stuck in the in-between, in the spaces that connect, but that aren't themselves destinations, that facilitate movement, but that aren't places, that exist but don't belong, that feel wrong because they are wrong, liminal spaces where reality shows its seams, and human consciousness recognizes something it's not supposed to see, the emptiness beneath occupation, the silence beneath noise, the wrongness beneath the functional surfaces we navigate daily, without ever quite acknowledging how strange these transitional spaces actually are, until we encounter them empty and realize with discomfort that we've been passing through wrong places our entire lives without ever quite noticing, until that moment when the space is empty and the lights are humming and we're alone, and suddenly the wrongness is unavoidable, is present, is all there is. Phantom time, hypothesis, 300 years that never happened. What if the year isn't actually 2025, but 1728? What if nearly 3 centuries of history that we've been taught actually never occurred? We're completely fabricated, inserted into the timeline by a conspiracy so vast and so successful that it convinced the entire world that events happened, people lived, and empires rose and fell during a period that was actually just blank space, empty time that was papered over with invented chronicles and forged documents. This is the phantom time hypothesis, proposed by German historian Heribert Illig in 1991, suggesting that the years between 614 and 911 AD never happened, that approximately 297 years were added to the calendar through deliberate falsification coordinated between Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. According to this theory, they wanted to position themselves at the symbolically significant year 1000 AD, rather than the actual year 703, so they simply added centuries to the timeline, invented historical figures and events to populate those centuries, forged documents and artifacts to support the narrative, and succeeded so thoroughly that every culture and civilization on Earth somehow accepted this fabricated chronology without anyone noticing or preserving accurate records that would contradict it. The implications are staggering. If Illig is correct, then Charlemagne never existed. The early Islamic conquests didn't happen as described, and entire architectural marvels attributed to the Dark Ages were actually built in completely different time periods by cultures we've misidentified because we're operating from a timeline that's off by 300 years. The hypothesis originates from Illig's observation that the period between roughly 600 and 900 AD, what we call the early Middle Ages or Dark Ages, has suspicious characteristics that make it seem less historically substantial than the periods before and after it. There's a relative scarcity of contemporary documents from this era, architecture, and artifacts that appear to be from earlier or later periods contaminating the archaeological record, and what Illig interprets as a fundamental discontinuity in cultural and technological development that suggests something is wrong with the chronology. If you removed those 300 years from the timeline, he argues, the progression from late antiquity to the high Middle Ages makes more sense, flows more naturally without the problematic Dark Age interruption that has always puzzled historians trying to explain why civilization seemed to regress dramatically before recovering. The motivation Illig proposes is both political and religious. The year 1000 AD held enormous symbolic significance in Christian eschatology. It represented the millennium, the 1,000-year anniversary of Christ's birth, a numerologically perfect moment that rulers would want to claim for their reigns. Otto III crowned emperor in 996, Sylvester II becoming pope in 999. Both men were scholars interested in calendrical reform, and both stood to gain tremendously from positioning themselves as rulers during this momentous year. If the actual date was 703 by accurate count, but they wanted their reigns to coincide with the year 1000, the solution would be to simply add the missing years to the calendar, to declare that the year was actually 996, and that the previous 3 centuries had occurred, even though they hadn't, filling those phantom centuries with invented history that would justify and legitimize the new chronology. The mechanism for pulling off such a fraud would require coordinating the falsification across multiple domains. Documents would need to be forged or backdated, chronicles and letters claiming to be from the phantom centuries, giving them apparent historical authenticity. Artifacts would need to be misdated or deliberately created to appear older than they actually were. Architectural structures would need to be attributed to periods when they weren't actually built. And crucially, every culture, every nation, every record-keeping system across Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond would need to either participate in the conspiracy or somehow fail to notice or preserve evidence that the chronology was wrong. This is where the hypothesis becomes difficult for many historians to accept. The scale of coordination and the thoroughness of the deception required seem implausible to the point of impossibility. But Illig points to specific evidence he argues supports the hypothesis. The scarcity of physical evidence from the Phantom period is one element. Archaeological findings from 600 to 900 AD are disproportionately rare compared to earlier and later periods. Contemporary written sources are suspiciously limited, with many accounts from that era actually being later copies or compositions that might have been created after the fact to fill in a timeline that needed historical content. The donation of Constantine, a document supposedly from the 4th century, granting the Pope temporal authority, was proven to be a forgery from a much later period. If one document of enormous historical significance was fabricated, might the entire concept of fabricating historical documents to support political and religious agendas be more widespread than we acknowledge. Carbon dating is often cited as evidence against phantom time. We can date materials scientifically and establish chronologies that should be independent of historical records. But Illig argues that carbon dating calibration depends on dendrochronology, tree ring dating, which itself depends on establishing reference chronologies that assume the historical timeline is correct. If the timeline is wrong, the calibration is circular, using the incorrect historical record to calibrate a supposedly independent scientific dating method, which then confirms the historical record it was calibrated against. This creates a closed loop where the error perpetuates itself through every system we use to verify dates. The Gregorian calendar reform in 1582 is another element Illig examines. Pope Gregory XIII corrected a drift between the calendar and the astronomical year, but the correction was for approximately 10 days, when the actual drift should have been closer to 13 days, given the rate of drift and the time elapsed since the Julian calendar was implemented. Illig suggests this discrepancy might indicate that fewer years actually passed than the historical chronology claims, that the calendar drift reflects the real time elapsed rather than the fabricated timeline, and that the smaller than expected correction is evidence that 3 centuries of phantom time had been inserted and weren't actually accumulating calendar drift because they never actually occurred. Architectural evidence is cited both for and against the hypothesis. Romanesque architecture appears rather suddenly in the historical record around the year 1000, as if it had no developmental period. Illig suggests that Romanesque architecture was actually developing during what we're told is the late Roman period, and that the phantom centuries create an artificial gap in the architectural record that makes it seem like styles appeared without precedent when actually the intervening time never happened, and the sudden appearance reflects continuous development that only seems interrupted because of the inserted phantom time. The hypothesis faces severe criticism from mainstream historians and scientists. The problem of coordination is insurmountable in most scholars' view. How do you convince Islamic civilizations, the Byzantine Empire, Chinese dynasties, and countless other independent record-keeping societies across the world to all adopt a falsified chronology? Islamic sources have their own calendrical systems and historical records that should be independent of European Christian calendar manipulation. Yet they document events and dates that correspond with the European timeline when converted. Chinese astronomical records from the period record events, like eclipses and comets, that can be independently verified through astronomical modeling, confirming that those years occurred when the historical chronology claims they did. Documents that can be scientifically dated to the phantom period through methods independent of calibration against historical chronology also pose problems for the hypothesis. Volcanic eruptions leave traces in ice cores that can be counted back year by year, providing absolute chronology that should be independent of human calendars. These ice core records don't show a 300-year discrepancy with the historical timeline. Astronomical events mentioned in texts can be dated precisely through celestial mechanics calculations that don't depend on accepting any particular chronology. And these also align with the traditional timeline rather than suggesting it's off by 3 centuries. The hypothesis has been expanded and modified by various proponents, with some suggesting smaller amounts of phantom time or different periods that were fabricated. Some focus on specific regions or dynasties, rather than claiming a global conspiracy. But the core phantom time hypothesis, as Illig proposed, it claims a specific 300-year period was entirely invented, which requires either accepting that the conspiracy was more vast and more successful than any other historical deception, or that all the various independent verification methods are flawed in ways that happen to produce the same incorrect timeline. Charlemagne is a central figure in the debate because he supposedly lived and ruled during the heart of the Phantom period. Illig suggests Charlemagne is a complete fabrication, an invented ruler whose story combines elements from earlier and later figures, created to populate the empty timeline with a suitably impressive emperor who could serve as a historical anchor point for the fabricated chronology. The evidence for Charlemagne's existence, documents, contemporary accounts, architectural projects attributed to his reign, is all dismissed as later fabrication or misdated material from different periods. For mainstream historians, Charlemagne's historicity is well established through multiple independent sources, making his complete fabrication essentially impossible. For phantom time proponents, the lack of truly contemporary physical evidence and the suspicious perfection of his legendary status suggests he's too good to be true, an invented ideal rather than a real person. The psychological appeal of the phantom time hypothesis is worth considering. It suggests that consensus reality is wrong in a fundamental way, that everyone has been fooled by a massive deception, that you can be smart enough to see through it, where billions of others have been duped. This is attractive to certain mindsets, providing the satisfaction of secret knowledge and the elevation of being one of the few who understands the truth. It also feeds into distrust of authorities and institutions. If they lied about 300 years of history, what else are they lying about? But the hypothesis also raises interesting questions about history and chronology, even if the specific claim is false. How much confidence should we have in timelines derived from documents that have been copied and recopied through centuries? How do we know that the versions we have are accurate to the originals? How much historical knowledge is actually circular, with different sources corroborating each other, not because they're independent, but because later sources copied earlier ones, creating the illusion of independent confirmation? Even if 300 years weren't invented wholesale, are there smaller falsifications and errors that have accumulated in the historical record, making our understanding of the past less accurate than we assume? The phenomenon of chronological revision is actually well documented on smaller scales. Dates have been corrected as better evidence emerges. Historical figures once thought to exist have been proven to be legendary or composite. Documents once considered authentic have been revealed as forgeries. So the concept of chronology being wrong isn't absurd in principle. It's only the scale Illig proposes that makes the phantom time hypothesis hard for mainstream academia to accept. If he claimed 50 years were invented, or that a specific dynasty's chronology was inflated, it would be more plausible, even if still controversial. 300 years affecting the entire world is where the hypothesis stretches credibility beyond what evidence can support. Testing the hypothesis definitively is challenging because any evidence against it can be dismissed by proponents as part of the fabrication or as calibrated against the false chronology and therefore invalid. This makes it essentially unfalsifiable from the believer's perspective. Every attempt to disprove it is explained away as contaminated by the very conspiracy it's trying to test. This is a characteristic of many alternative historical theories and makes productive debate difficult because there's no evidence that would be accepted as conclusive disproof. The cultural impact of the hypothesis has been modest. It's known in alternative history communities and among those interested in chronological controversies, but it hasn't achieved mainstream acceptance or seriously challenged academic consensus about the historical timeline. It serves more as a thought experiment and a fringe theory that raises interesting questions about how we establish historical knowledge, even if the specific claim about phantom centuries is almost certainly false. What the phantom time hypothesis does effectively is demonstrate how much of what we know about the past depends on trust. Trust in documents, trust in institutions that preserve and interpret them, trust in methods of dating and verification. If that trust is misplaced, if there are systematic errors or deliberate deceptions in the chain of evidence, then our understanding of history could be dramatically wrong. Illig asks us to consider that possibility in the most extreme form, suggesting 300 years of fabrication. And while most historians find the evidence for that specific claim insufficient, the underlying question remains valid. How do we know the history we've been taught is accurate? What would it look like if it wasn't? And how would we detect a falsification that was thorough and coordinated enough to fool everyone for centuries? Whether the phantom time hypothesis is a legitimate historical controversy or an elaborate misunderstanding of how historical evidence works, it represents a fascinating challenge to consensus chronology. A suggestion that time itself, as we understand it, might be a construction, that the years we count might not correspond to years that actually elapsed, that history as written might contain not just errors and biases, but wholesale fabrications that have become so embedded in our understanding of the past that questioning them seems absurd. Even though, if they existed, that absolute confidence in their truth would be exactly what you'd expect from a successful historical fraud. The calendar says it's 2025. Heribert Illig says it's 1728. Mainstream historians say Illig is wrong and can prove it through multiple independent verification methods. But late at night, when you think about how much of what you know about the past you've never actually verified yourself, about how you trust documents and dates because authorities tell you they're accurate, about how a conspiracy that succeeded completely would look exactly like consensus reality, because consensus reality is what it would have created. The phantom time hypothesis whispers that maybe, just maybe, 300 years of history never happened, were invented by rulers who wanted to position themselves at a symbolically perfect moment in time, and succeeded so thoroughly that more than 1,000 years later, we still believe in centuries that were actually empty, still count years that never occurred, still date events to a timeline that's off by 3 centuries, still trust a historical narrative that was fabricated by people who understood that if you control the past, you control the present, and if you control the calendar, you control time itself, making everyone believe they're living in the year 2025, when the real year, the accurate count of time that's actually elapsed since the point we call year 0, might be something quite different, something several centuries earlier, meaning we're all living in the wrong time, believing in a chronology that was invented, trusting a timeline that was fabricated, and accepting without question centuries of history that Heribert Illig insists never happened at all. Dulce Base, underground human-alien genetic experiments. Beneath the desert rock of northern New Mexico, near the small town of Dulce on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, something allegedly exists that the government will never acknowledge. Not a storage facility, not a communications hub, not a simple underground military installation, like hundreds of others scattered across the American Southwest. According to those who claim to have worked there, to have been held there, or to have stumbled upon evidence of its existence, Dulce Base is a joint human-alien facility descending 7 levels deep into the earth, where genetic experiments are conducted that violate every understanding of ethics, biology, and human rights. The deeper you go, the darker the work becomes, until at the lowest levels, you find things that can't be called human anymore. Things that were human once, things created from scratch that were never human at all. If even a fraction of what whistleblowers describe is true, then everything we've been told about alien contact, government cooperation, and the sanctity of human autonomy is a comfortable lie masking a nightmare operating just beneath our feet. The story of Dulce Base emerged primarily through the testimony of Phil Schneider and Thomas Costello, two men who claimed direct involvement with the facility and who both met mysterious ends after going public with their allegations. Schneider described himself as a geological engineer, working on underground base construction for the government and military contractors. In the late 1970s, he was allegedly part of a drilling operation near Dulce when they broke through into an existing cavern system. What they found inside wasn't natural. The caverns had been modified, expanded, and occupied by beings that weren't human. A firefight erupted, Schneider was injured, and in the chaos he claimed to have seen technology and entities that convinced him humanity had made agreements with extraterrestrial species. Agreements that traded access to human subjects for technological knowledge. Thomas Costello claimed to be a security officer at Dulce Base, working in the facility for years before his conscience or his fear drove him to leave and attempt to expose what was happening. He described a massive multi-level complex built into the mesa, with the upper levels occupied by human personnel and conventional operations. Offices, security stations, storage areas that could plausibly be explained if discovered. But the lower levels, accessed through security checkpoints that grew progressively more restrictive, contained laboratories where the line between human and alien blurred until it dissolved entirely. Costello spoke of seeing humans in cages, of witnessing procedures where genetics were being manipulated, where consciousness was being altered or transferred, where things that had started as human were being transformed into something else entirely. The facility is described as a joint operation with human scientists and military personnel working alongside gray aliens. The archetypal beings with large heads, enormous black eyes, and thin bodies that appear in countless abduction reports. But according to Dulce witnesses, these grays aren't simply visiting. They're resident, permanent, occupying sections of the base as if it's their facility as much as ours. The cooperation between human and alien personnel is described as hierarchical but complex, with some areas off limits to humans, others restricted to specific clearance levels, and tension between the two species barely contained beneath operational protocols. This isn't peaceful scientific collaboration. It's an arrangement born from power imbalance, from humanity's desperation for advanced technology and the aliens' need for something we possess: biological material, genetic diversity, or access to human consciousness for purposes we can't fully understand. Level 6 and 7 are where the horror intensifies according to testimony. Costello described rows of cages containing humans in various states of alteration. Some appeared drugged, barely conscious, bodies showing signs of surgical intervention or genetic modification. Others were hybrids, beings that combined human and alien features in ways that suggested they'd been created rather than born, grown in artificial wombs or vats for purposes that remained obscure. He spoke of a section he called Nightmare Hall, where the most extreme experiments were conducted, where things existed that couldn't be categorized as human or alien, but represented some twisted fusion of both. The suffering in these areas was immense, though many subjects appeared too altered to fully comprehend their condition, their minds broken or modified along with their bodies. The genetic work allegedly pursued at Dulce involves attempts to create hybrid species that combine human adaptability and consciousness with alien physiology and abilities. The Greys, some theories suggest, are themselves a dying species, genetically stagnant, unable to reproduce successfully without outside intervention. Their interest in human genetics stems from desperate need. We possess something they've lost, some vitality or diversity that could revive their species or create a hybrid successor. The experiments explore which human traits are compatible with alien genetics, how consciousness translates between species, whether the essential qualities that make us human can survive being housed in non-human biology. Each hybrid represents data. Each failed experiment teaches them something, and the human cost is apparently acceptable to whatever authority authorized this arrangement. But hybridization flows both ways. According to some accounts, human subjects are allegedly modified to be more alien, to survive in different atmospheric conditions, or to possess enhanced abilities. These experiments test the limits of how far human biology can be pushed before something fundamental breaks. Costello described subjects whose skeletal structure had been altered, whose organs had been modified or replaced with artificial or alien equivalents, whose nervous systems had been augmented with technology that blurred the line between living tissue and machine. The goal, he suggested, was creating humans who could survive extreme environments, who could interface directly with alien technology, or who could serve purposes that normal human biology wouldn't permit. The question of consent is central to the horror of Dulce. Where do these subjects come from? Abduction reports have been documented for decades. People claiming to be taken against their will, subjected to medical procedures aboard craft or in facilities they couldn't identify, then returned with missing time and fragmentary memories. Skeptics attribute these to sleep paralysis, false memories, or psychological conditions. But if Dulce exists, if underground facilities are conducting genetic experiments requiring human subjects, then abduction would be the mechanism for acquiring test subjects who won't be missed, or whose disappearance can be explained away. Missing person statistics show thousands of people vanishing every year without resolution. How many might have ended up in facilities like Dulce, their disappearance attributed to running away, foul play, or voluntary departure, when the truth is imprisonment in underground laboratories where their humanity is systematically stripped away. The technology described at Dulce goes beyond genetics. Costello spoke of vats where beings were grown rapidly from genetic templates, artificial wombs that could produce a fully developed hybrid in months, rather than the 9-month human gestation period. He described devices that could extract consciousness or transfer it between bodies, technology that treated the mind as software that could be copied, moved, or deleted. The implications are staggering. If consciousness can be extracted and stored, then death becomes optional for those with access to the technology. If it can be transferred, then bodies become disposable vehicles. If it can be copied, then the very concept of individual identity dissolves. What would you call a being that has your memories, your personality, your sense of self, but exists in a cloned body or an alien form? Is it you? Is it a copy? Does the distinction even matter? The alleged 1979 incident at Dulce represents a moment when cooperation collapsed into violence. According to Schneider and others, human personnel became increasingly disturbed by what they were witnessing in the lower levels. The treatment of human subjects, the nature of the experiments, the goals that seemed to serve alien interests far more than human benefit. Tension grew until it erupted into armed conflict. Humans and aliens exchanged fire in the underground tunnels. Casualties occurred on both sides. Schneider claimed to have been hit by an alien weapon that nearly killed him. Other sources suggest dozens died in the firefight before the situation was contained. Afterward, security was tightened. Human access to the lower levels became even more restricted, and anyone who knew too much about what sparked the conflict was reassigned or eliminated. The town of Dulce itself sits unaware above these alleged horrors. Population around 3,000, mostly Jicarilla Apache, living ordinary lives with no knowledge that beneath them might exist one of the most significant and disturbing secrets in human history. Except that some residents report strange things. Unexplained aircraft, particularly at night, lights moving in patterns that don't match conventional aviation, cattle mutilations that plague the region, animals found drained of blood with surgical precision, organs removed in ways that suggest advanced technology and purposes beyond simple predation or ritual. Sounds from beneath the ground, vibrations felt through the earth, phenomena that could be dismissed individually but collectively paint a picture of something unusual occurring in the area. The military presence near Dulce is documented and undeniable. Los Alamos National Laboratory, where nuclear weapons research continues, sits less than 100 miles away. Kirtland Air Force Base, associated with nuclear weapons and special projects, is nearby. The region has been home to classified research for decades, with vast stretches of federal land closed to public access. The infrastructure for underground facilities exists. We know the government has built installations below ground for continuity of operations, for storing sensitive materials, for conducting research that requires isolation. The question isn't whether underground bases exist in the Southwest. The question is what's being done in them, and whether any involve cooperation with non-human intelligence. Skeptics point to the lack of physical evidence, the absence of satellite imagery, showing the massive ventilation systems and power infrastructure that a 7-level underground facility would require, the fact that both primary witnesses are dead and their claims can't be verified. Phil Schneider died in 1996, found strangled with a catheter tube wrapped around his neck, officially ruled a suicide despite the manner of death and his repeated statements that he feared assassination. Thomas Costello disappeared in the late 80s after allegedly stealing photographs and video from Dulce Base, materials that were supposed to prove his claims but have never surfaced publicly. His wife and child disappeared with him. No bodies were found. No trace of their whereabouts has emerged. This could mean they're living under assumed identities in hiding, or it could mean they were eliminated along with the evidence they carried. The deeper implication of Dulce, if any version of it is real, extends beyond genetic experiments. It suggests a relationship between human government, presumably elements operating above conventional oversight, and alien species, a relationship based on trade, technology for access, advanced knowledge for biological material. The cooperation required to build and operate a joint facility implies communication, negotiation, agreements. When did this relationship begin? What authority decided humanity would enter into this arrangement? What were we promised in exchange for giving alien intelligence access to human subjects? And most disturbing, what happens if we try to back out of the agreement now? Do we even have that option, or have we become dependent on whatever technology we've received, locked into a relationship we can't escape without losing capabilities that have become essential? The genetic experiments also raise questions about other programs and phenomena. Are some UFO abductions actually human military operations designed to provide subjects for Dulce-like facilities while maintaining the alien cover story? Are the hybrids being created eventually released into the human population, walking among us indistinguishable from normal humans, but engineered for purposes we can't detect? Do the modifications and procedures pioneered on non-consenting subjects at Dulce eventually get refined and offered as enhancements to elite humans, creating a breakaway civilization that's genetically diverging from baseline humanity? Each question spawns more questions, a fractal of disturbing possibilities, branching from the central premise that somewhere beneath the New Mexico desert, in laboratories carved into ancient rock, the boundaries of species and consciousness are being violated in the name of advancement or survival, or purposes we aren't meant to understand. Visitors to the Dulce area sometimes report strange compulsions, feelings of being watched, dreams or visions of underground facilities and gray figures, missing time they can't account for. These experiences could be suggestibility, the power of expecting to experience something unusual in a location associated with conspiracy theories. Or they could be residual effects of whatever actually occurs there, psychic contamination from the suffering and violation happening below. Or active scanning and influence from the facility's occupants, ensuring that no one who gets too close remembers enough to cause problems. The desert keeps secrets well, and the Earth provides perfect cover for operations that must never see daylight. Whether Dulce Base exists exactly as described, whether it's a distorted version of something that operates differently than witnesses understood, or whether it's entirely fabricated from fear and speculation, the concept resonates because it crystallizes anxieties we all carry about government secrecy, alien contact, and bodily autonomy. The fear that authorities have made deals we didn't consent to. The terror that advanced beings view us as resources rather than equals. The nightmare that human bodies and consciousness could be manipulated without permission or recourse. Dulce Base is where all these fears converge beneath the Earth, hidden from oversight, operating according to ethics that would horrify anyone who learned the details. And if Phil Schneider and Thomas Costello were telling the truth, if their deaths were the cost of trying to expose what they knew, then somewhere right now, beneath the desert, in levels descending deeper into darkness, work continues that we're better off never seeing. Experiments proceeding that answer questions we should never have asked, creating beings that should never exist. All in service of an arrangement between species that treats humanity not as partners, but as livestock, raw material for an agenda we'll never be permitted to fully understand.